the Gospel of Matthew chapter 5. We're just going to read one single verse for this morning as we gain our scripture thought for today. You know, when you have the opportunity to preach as often as I do, and I do have a lot of opportunity to preach, and don't hear that as a complaint, because my position in Oklahoma City I had for 5 years, I never got a chance to preach unless someone invited me to come and preach. And so I'm very thankful for the opportunity I have to preach. But when you get to preach as often as I do, I have to look for sermon ideas everywhere. I have to look for them in my own private study. I have to look for them in life circumstance. Well, some time back, I had gone to one of our local convenience stores to buy me something to drink. And I was standing there in front of the display case to buy me a soda. Let me make that clear. To buy me a soda in front of there at the convenience store, and I just picked out a soda and I was carrying it up to the front, and I just happened to look at it, and it had something printed on the side of it that made me just go, because printed on the side of that soda can was this: very low sodium. Very low sodium. And when I read that, you know, the verse that's on the screen, I guess it's on the screen, is the verse that came to mind as quickly as it came to your mind. You've read it before. I've read it before. We'll read it together here. You are the salt of the earth. But if the salt loses its flavor, how shall it be seasoned? It is then good for nothing but to be thrown out and trampled underfoot by men. I thought about that verse as I was carrying that can, very low sodium. And then I asked myself, Russell, are you a very low sodium Christian? Are you a low sodium Christian? Jesus tells me to be the salt of the earth, but am I a very low sodium Christian? Well, of course, if I'm going to ask the question for myself, I'm not going to be the only one in the boat, because I thought of all of you. I thought of all the church family here at First Baptist Church, and I asked myself the question for all of us: are we low sodium Christians? When Jesus tells us to be the salt of the earth, are we salty salt, or are we low sodium Christians? Now, you might think that Jesus telling us to be the salt of the earth would be something very easy to identify and what he means by it. But what you need to remember, though, is in the first century, salt had a lot of different uses. It had a lot of different uses. You know, you find it salt flavored, salt preserved, salt fertilized, salt was an antiseptic, salt was used in the Jewish sacrifice. So what exactly did Jesus have in mind when he says that we are the salt of the earth? Did he mean one of those in particular? Did he mean a combination of that? Or did he mean something much broader than that? When Jesus said that we are the salt of the earth, what did he have in mind when he was telling his disciples, you are the salt of the earth? Could it be in this very familiar text that Jesus uses this very simple truth to remind his disciples then, and if we consider ourselves disciples now, maybe he's reminding us of our function and of our responsibility. Maybe he's reminding us of our function and our responsibility. Maybe he uses this very simple illustration to remind his disciples then and now who we are and what we are to do. Maybe that's why he uses this very simple illustration. It seems to be that he's telling his disciples that, well, for me, if I had to just sum it all up in one little phrase, if I had the margin of my Bible and I just put a line like this between verses 13 and 14, I think that what Jesus would be trying to tell his disciples and his disciples now would be this: we are to be people of influence. When he tells us to be the salt of the earth, and when he tells us to be the light of the world, he's reminding his disciples then and his disciples now, all of us who consider ourselves Jesus followers, he reminds us that we are to be people of influence. That we should be able to influence life for the good. Jesus has just finished the Beatitudes, and many of you are familiar with those, but it seems to be that Jesus would say this: in order to live out your calling, in order to live out the Beatitudes, not only are you going to face persecution, not only is there a high likelihood that you're going to face persecution, but there's a high likelihood that you will either consciously or unconsciously influence people that are around you. We are to be a people of influence. We are to influence the lives of people around us. And reminding his disciples that they are salt. He's reminding his disciples that they are to be different than the world. It seems to be that Jesus would tell us that if we want to be people of influence, it is our uniqueness that makes us special. It's our uniqueness in that we're different from the world that makes us usable. It's in our lifestyle where it points to the fact that we have spent time with Jesus and our life is different, that Jesus can use us in a very special way. Our value rests in our difference, how we live our life differently each day. That's when the world takes notice of us. When you're living next door and the lost world knows what's going on in your life, and they begin to ask questions like, how is it that they live differently than I do? They've got the same problems, same challenges, same circumstances. How is it that they live different than me? How is it that their love is so rich and so deep and so lasting, and my love seems to be so shallow and insignificant? Where does the joy come from in their life? I know what they're facing. I know what challenges that they're confronting. Where is this joy that they're having? You realize it's when we're different that the Lord can use us to touch a lost world. It's in our uniqueness. So he comes in this text and he says, you are. He says, you are. He's not stating a command, he's just stating a fact. He's just making a complete, just a simple declarative statement. You are. He's not saying you can be. He's not even suggesting an imperative command that you must be. It's just a simple declarative statement. You are. If we are a Jesus follower, if our life has been touched and saved by the King of the world, then we are his followers. And we are to be salt. Now, the degree of salt and our degree of usefulness will depend on our uniqueness. Some of us are salty. Some of us are diluted, but we're still salt. Our lives can either be used to influence the world for good, or it seems to be, if you take the metaphor very seriously, Jesus, if our life is not able to be used for good, Jesus just kind of sweeps us over to the curb and leaves us and goes find some other person that he can use. We are to be a people of influence. You know, there's little question that computers have changed our world and have influenced the way we live. Everything from the car that we drive to how we read the newspaper, from how we connect on social media to the way we entertain ourselves. For some of us, that would be okay, but about the time we think we've got our computer figured out, they introduce Windows 8 and everything's out the window. We can't figure it out. Windows 8 is too much for me. I can't figure it out. But as much as the world has been influenced by computers, what Jesus would tell you and me as his disciples is that we as his disciples should be an influence. A positive influence for the kingdom. We should be an influence. When calling us to be salt, the salt of the earth, perhaps Jesus is reminding us who we are and what we are to be about as his disciples. So normally I don't have an alliterated sermon where I have 3 points that all start with the same letter, but this one just worked out that way this week. And so as I make my way through the rest of this message, you'll see the 3 P's of discipleship. The first is the properties of discipleship. As I mentioned earlier, there are many uses in the New Testament for salt. There were many different ways in which it was used. If I had to pick a primary use for the application of what Jesus might be saying to you and me in the day in which we live, I believe that Jesus would come and say that we as his disciples are to be the ones that preserve, that we are the ones that stop the retardation, that stop the degradation, that stand in the face of the corruption of our society. That we are to be His people that are a moral influence, that we are His people that stand in the midst of the world and say, no, that is not right. This is what Jesus does. We are a people that live our life in such a way that the world knows that we have spent time with Him and our life is different as a result. You are my disciples, He says. You are the salt of the earth, retarding the rot and decay of the dying world. In every situation, whether it's public or private, individual or group, social or vocational, His disciples their presence should be something that retards and inhibits and arrests and destroys and deteriorates, that stands in the destruction and deterioration of our society. We are to be different. Sure, the Lord has put the government and its laws in place in order that it might slow it down, but it seems to be that God intends that the most powerful influence that stands in our community, the most abiding influence, should be the redeemed, regenerate, and righteous people of His own. Tasker in his commentary says Jesus' disciples are a moral disinfectant in a world where moral standards are low, constantly changing, or non-existent. It was the late John Stott that said this. He says, many say, what's wrong with the world? He says, we don't need to say what's wrong with the world. Sin has been brought out. He says, the question we might ask is this: what's wrong with the salt? Not what's wrong with the world, but what is wrong with the salt? The problem of our day, and it will become even more of one, is that our world is so corrupt. Not only does it believe its corruption is justified, but our world will begin and has already begun and will continue. It will attack anyone that stands in opposition to its corruption. It's so bent on the fact that their corruption and their thought process are justified. Anyone that says anything different will be attacked. And that will be the case with Christians. You can't flip channels for very long before you find some media pundit attacking some form of biblical truth. But persecuted or not, attacked or not, Jesus wants His people to continue to be a positive influence in our decaying society. Barbara Walters, years before the Gulf War, went to Kuwait. And she was really going over there to discover gender and gender roles. She went over there, did a story on gender roles in Kuwait. And what she noticed when she got over to Kuwait was that the women would walk 10 feet behind their husbands. And I don't see anything wrong with that. No, I'm just kidding. They would walk 10 feet behind their husbands. But after the war, she went back and she noticed that the roles had been reversed. And now the women were walking 10 feet in front of their husbands. And so she asked, why is that? She came and asked one lady, she says, why is it that the roles are reversed and now you are walking in front of your husband? And with simplicity, she said, landmines. Landmines. That's why the roles had been reversed. It should be that Christians and not landmines should change and make a difference. We should be the ones that are slowing the process of decay in our own society. You know, for instance, even in our own local newspaper, last Sunday morning on Easter Sunday, on the front page, our local newspaper wrote an article that is contrary to the Christian belief and teaching on marriage. Did any of us say anything? The properties of discipleship. Then you find the persons of discipleship. We'll hit this quickly as I've highlighted that we are the salt. We are the people of influence. We are the ones that are to make a difference. The people of discipleship. That we are His disciples, are His people, are the persons of discipleship, and as a result we are the salt. That His people, if we want to be salt, will be a people of character. We will be a people of influence. We do not reflect the world. We do not reflect the world's clothing or words or priorities or lives we live. Our witness should be clear that our life is different because we have been with Jesus. Did you notice His word of danger? Did you notice His word of danger? You are the salt of the earth. But if the salt loses its flavor, what good is it? There's a word of danger for the people, for the salt. Now, in reality, salt cannot lose its flavor. The way it's combined, it cannot lose its flavor unless it is diluted, unless it is combined with, say, sand or dirt. It will lose its ability to be a real life changer. It will lose its ability to influence that which it's touched. If it's diluted with the things of the world, it loses its saltiness. And Jesus says, listen, what do you do with salt that has lost its flavor? He says it's good for nothing. It needs to just be thrown out on the street so people can walk on it. What is Jesus telling his disciples? Is he saying to us that if we lose our saltiness, if we compromise our life and living with the world, if we are diluted by the world's principles and priorities, and we lose our saltiness, does that mean we've lost our salvation? For me, the answer is no. For me, what Jesus is describing is not the loss of salvation, but the loss of opportunity. If a disciple assimilates to the world by taking on its values and passions, priorities and lifestyle, then that disciple loses its opportunity, their opportunity, his opportunity, her opportunity to influence the world. Christianity may make peace with the world in order to avoid persecution, but by doing so, my brothers and sisters, we render ourselves impotent to influence the world. Jesus looks for people, his disciples, to be people of character, of difference, so he can use their life to influence the world. Can I make this suggestion to you? Be sure to guard your influence. Be sure to guard your reputation. It is much easier to lose than it is to gain back. Guard your reputation. A disciple of Jesus can lose their influence with a harsh word. A disciple of Jesus can lose their influence with a careless act. God's forgiveness can be found and experienced, but that doesn't mean that their witness or influence is not in some way retarded. It is not totally restored. There appears to be a Humpty Dumpty effect that if we do something to lose our influence, if we do something to lose our reputation, it may not be totally put back together again, even if we have the forgiveness of God on our life. It's found in a little boy that lost his temper. Had a habit of losing his temper. Finally, his dad just had enough of him, and he came to his little boy and he gave him a sack of nails and a hammer. And he says, every time you lose your temper, I want you to go out to the back fence and I want you to drive a nail into the back fence. The first day, he drives 37 nails into the back fence. The next day, it's less. The next day, it's less. The next day, it's less. And finally, he begins to realize it's a lot easier to control my temper than it is to walk back to that fence and have to drive another nail. And so finally, after 2 or 3 days, and for 2 or 3 days, he can come to his dad and he said, Dad, I haven't driven a nail in 3 or 4 days. It's been great. It's been great. His dad said, well, great. Now I want you to go back to the back fence, and every day you don't drive a nail in, I want you to take a nail out. And so every day, he does not lose his temper. He goes back and he pulls the nail out, and he pulls the nail out. And after a series of weeks, he comes back and he said, Dad, listen, all the nails are out of the fence. Everything is out of the fence. He said, all right, son, let's walk back to the fence. So he walks back to the fence. He said, son, did you take a look at the fence? Take a look at it. You realize that with every act of anger, regardless of how many times you say you're sorry, you leave a scar. There's a hole in the fence because you lost your anger, you lost your temper. Be careful. Don't lose your influence don't lose your reputation because of a careless act, because it's easier to lose than what you might think. The properties and the people, and finally you find the place of discipleship. You find that in our little text here when it says we are the salt of the home, or we're the salt of the church. Is that what this passage says? We are the salt of the church. No, that's not what it says. It says we are the salt of the earth. Not just the salt of the church. Sure, we are to be a people of character and influence in the church, but that's not where it needs to remain. We are to take and live and be salt where we live. The call is for believers to leave our holy huddles and live the Christian life in the world. We are the salt of the earth. We are the salt of the world. We are to live our life and be an influence, a godly influence, everywhere we live. Everywhere we go, we are to be a positive influence for the kingdom. We need to be salt outside of the walls. Our emphasis does not need to be. We don't need to be engrossed in how to reorganize all the salt. We don't need to study 101 ways to keep the salt dry. It doesn't need to be my focus all the time on entertaining the salt or trying to keep the salt happy. That's not the purpose of the church. The purpose of the church is to come, and this is a basis for our ministry, but our place for our ministry is out beyond the walls. And we need to encourage our people to come and be salt out in the world. We're going to have a baptism next Sunday morning, I guess. A lady came this morning, and one of our members had been visiting with her, and she came by and made an appointment with me this week, and she was ready to give her life to Jesus. It was low-hanging fruit, really easy to lead her to Christ. But you see, our church member was being salt where she lived. She was being salt where she went every day. She was touching lives of people where she spent her time. And that's what Jesus would want us to be. Salt not just inside of here, but salt everywhere we go. It's like that pre-med student at the University of Berkeley. He tells the testimony of the fact that he became a Christian after a long series of doubts and questions in his own life. He became a Christian. This is how he became a Christian. He became deathly ill with the flu, and for 10 days he missed his organic chemistry class. But a guy that he didn't really know that well came and got his homework for him every day, took it back to him, and taught him organic chemistry so that he wouldn't get behind. And he kept saying, why is this guy doing this? I don't understand. People don't do this anymore. And he says, I got to be quite honest with you, I wouldn't do it for him. But every day he would gather his homework and he would take it back to him and teach him organic chemistry. And after 10 days, he finally looked at him and said, why are you doing this? Why are you doing this? And the young man said, well, I'm a Christ follower. And Jesus told me to be salt and light in this world. And I found a way that I could share Christ with you. After the 10 days, he followed him all the way back to his church and gave his life to Jesus. We're the salt, not of just the church. We're the salt of the earth. I guess a dozen of us, a dozen of us, or a baker's dozen of us went to the men's retreat this week. And, I guess I'm just not real bright. I don't need any amens on that. But I just didn't really read the poster that close because we get down to the men's retreat this week. And guess what the title of the men's retreat is this week? Being a man of influence. Guess what the text is? Matthew 5:13. Well, at least God and I are on the same page. That's all I can say. I just wish I'd been brighter to read the poster. Maybe I would have been, I don't know. But here's the challenge that they gave us this week. They looked at us men and they said, men, are you a man of influence? Can you be a man of influence in your marriage? Can you be a man of influence, a positive influence in your marriage? Men, can you be a positive influence with your children? If you still have them at home, can you be a positive influence with your children? Men, can you be a positive influence in your home, in your community, where you work and where you play? Men, can you be a positive influence? You see, that's the call of being a disciple, is being a positive influence. Can we be that? That's the call for all of us here, whether we're male or female, teenager or not. That's the call for all of us. Can Jesus Christ use your life to be an influence, a positive influence? Maybe we need to take a moment during this invitation and get some things right with the Father in order that He can use our life. Would you bow with me?